Welcome to the webinar, Aligning R&D with what consumers will care about tomorrow. My name is Alina Struguț. I'm a principal analyst and research director here at Lux Research, and I'll be moderating today's session. Presenting today are my colleagues Cheryl Auger, senior director, and Matthew Watton, analyst here at Lux Research. Throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in the questions box on your screen. Time permitting, we will answer all the questions that we can. But if your questions don't get answered, please don't hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com. So that's questions@luxresearchinc.com, and we will respond. If at any point you experience technical difficulties, such as a frozen screen, simply refresh your browser and check that your connection is strong. Now, let's jump into the presentation.
Thank you, Alina. As you heard, today we're going to talk about how to identify the things that consumers are going to care about into the future to enable better innovation. And we want to start with a couple of really exciting examples where companies used signals very successfully. Our first example is Fenty Beauty. And Fenty Beauty treated inclusion as a cultural default. They identified a signal around frustration regarding the limited range of shades of foundation, as well as token representation in the beauty industry writ large. This was amplified by social media activism and meme culture. And we had many consumers asking, why does this range have 5 shades of beige? So what Fenty did was they launched 40 shades of foundation from day one, not as a diversity statement, but as a business as usual stance, an industry first at that scale. The result was some astounding commercial success, $100 million in sales in the first 40 days of launch. Within its first full year, Fenty Beauty reportedly earned $570 million in revenue. It was named one of Time Magazine's best inventions of 2017, and it made Rihanna the first Black woman to lead an LVMH luxury brand. The brand blurred the line between product and cultural statement. It was representation as innovation. And the lesson here is that recognizing inclusion as a cultural baseline rather than a niche value opened massive market growth. Matt, you have another example.
Yeah, the other example from a very different industry is Lego. Lego identified at an early stage the signal of the kidult. That is the rise in adults who are seeking mindful, nostalgic, creative escapes in a high-stress digital world. By identifying this growing signal early, they used it to innovate on their product line by developing the Lego Ideas platform, which is an 18+ line that has models for architecture, botanicals, more involved modeling kits, etc., rebranding their product for adult creativity. Here, Lego listened to an early signal that showed a cultural shift that there was an emerging market, namely adults that craved physical, creative play, and used it to develop products that cater to this market. And now, this has also been a success. Adult users make up 25 to 30% of Lego's consumer base. And so this is another example of them identifying a signal early and using it to market and to innovate products, right? So both the Lego and the Fenty Beauty show that innovation succeeds when companies are able to translate signals of cultural change into strategic opportunity, whether that's the kidult, whether that's about inclusivity or whatever. But the problem is, how are innovators going to identify these signals that are actually going to be meaningful? And how are they going to sort these signals from the noise? And that's what we want to get into today. And that's what we want to show how Lux is able to really help solve that specific problem.
Yeah, and so what we're going to do today is exactly that. We're going to discuss what a signal even is. Then we're going to tell you how we at Lux use anthropology to detect signals. Finally, we're going to end with a couple of examples of signals and talk about how they could be used for innovation. With that, Matt, what's a signal?
Great question, Cheryl. So when we talk about a signal, we mean an emerging cultural meaning. A signal is a new way consumers are framing, talking about, or connecting ideas. Unlike a full-blown trend or an established cultural belief, signals are at an early stage of development. They haven't fully taken root in the culture. They haven't broken into the mainstream. Yet a signal, while still being young and niche, has the potential for creating a long-term shift in how consumers believe, what their values are, or their behaviors as consumers. Because it's not mainstream, signals are often more subtle and therefore invisible, or at least much harder to detect when you only look at the mainstream or surface level of consumer cultures. So they're emerging, but they're hard to detect. Part of the reason they're hard to detect is because it's not clear that every new idea or new topic of conversation is a genuine signal, right? Kind of a non-scientific way to distinguish, but what we like to talk about is we want to distinguish a signal from, on the one hand, the noise. This is the loud trends that are capturing people's attention, such as like a meme or a celebrity-hyped product, and the fads. These are the flashy trends that have such a quick uptake. Remember fidget spinners? They never existed, and then boom, they were everywhere. But where are they now, right? So the volume and speed of the noise and fads, these are deceptive. Just because they have presence today and quick uptake doesn't mean that they will have any lasting significance or that they will make any impact on consumer culture for the long term. What we need then is a way to find the real signals, the ones that will endure, the ones that will grow, the ones that will become entrenched in consumer culture. And this is where our anthropological approach comes in. We like to say at Lux that signals live in meaning, not mentions. Unlike noise and unlike fads, a real signal is one that is rooted in deeper beliefs and values that consumers hold. Our anthropological and AI-driven approach is so powerful because it gets to the heart of consumer culture. Now, how do we do this? Well, what we do is look at topics in their cultural context. We are not interested in topics in isolation. We are rather interested in the deeper web of connections around a topic or idea. Our approach analyzes hundreds of thousands of consumer conversations in context to identify and understand topics at a deeper level, the level of how they're being used and how they're being talked about, not just that they're being talked about. This approach, in the first place, allows us to identify emerging signals that lie at the periphery of consumer culture or are hidden behind the noise of consumer culture. For instance, to see that adult nostalgia or digital fatigue is an emerging idea within a toy culture. It also allows us to measure an emerging signal's genuine relevance and to predict the future growth of that signal. One takeaway is that we do not track mentions, we measure growth. Looking at mentions alone fails to give an accurate understanding of the meaning of a topic or a signal. Do consumers really understand what this is about, or why they want it, or how it's going to fit into their daily lives? Instead of just looking at mentions, we use current conversations alongside historical data from the past 12 months to track and size topics. This historical data lets us see whether a topic is growing, but also whether it's resonating with other topics and whether it has any staying power, whether it's just going to be a blip or whether it's actually going to sustain and be relevant for more than a few weeks, more than a few months. The key here is Lux's focus on cultural maturity. Our measure is not a brute quantification that measures how popular a topic is. Rather, our cultural maturity metric measures how clearly and consistently an idea is understood by consumers, regardless of current product adoption levels. We're able to analyze if there is consensus or alignment that is growing in a culture, and then we can predict that that culture, that topic is growing, or if there's volatility, that is, if there's fragmentation or disagreement brewing within a culture, and then we would say it is not growing. When it comes to identifying signals, topics that are useful for innovation, especially, we look for topics that are at the early stages of maturity. We call these the new ideas and the early consensus, the first two on the left-hand side here. At this stage, broad agreement is lacking in the culture, and these ideas are fairly niche. And while meanings are emerging, they're not yet fixed in consumers' minds. And that's great for innovation. It's at this stage that these topics, these signals are most relevant. By identifying signals at these lower stages of consensus, we could measure their potential growth and see month over month, not just their usage, but also where a shared meaning or understanding is emerging among consumers. What other topics, what other themes is a signal, an idea becoming connected with in how consumers are approaching or thinking about this topic? Identifying signals at this early stage is most useful for innovation because it allows innovators to get an early understanding of an emerging culture rather than hopping on a trend that's already widely adopted with entrenched beliefs that it's too late for them to change or get in at the ground level. By acting early, brands could better establish themselves as thought leaders in a given context. They could take the insights that they gain from studying these low maturity signals and not just follow the culture, but actively shape how the culture will evolve, what with new products, with new marketing, with new solutions, etc. And finally, the other big benefit of starting early, of identifying these real genuine signals early, is that it avoids falling down rabbit holes. You are able to sort the signal from the noise. And this way you won't be spending time and R&D and resources following topics that are not going to be meaningful, that are not going to have a significant impact on the culture, that are going to, be flashes in the pan and burn out and fade away. So that is how we approach signals. We are interested not in mentions, but in meaning, and that allows us to track growth and see how and identify these signals at an earlier stage. So now I'm going to hand it back to Cheryl, who is going to give us some examples of how signals can be used for innovation, put some meat on the bones for how we think about signals in this context.
Great. Thanks for that great description. I'm going to start with an early signal, and that's food foraging. And at its core, foraging for food is going out into nature and finding food right at its source, growing wildly. But what does this mean to consumers? And why does this matter as a signal for us? So from a consumer vantage point, foraging is about reconnecting with nature and engaging in activities that bring them closer to the natural environment. This is a connection that's seen as a way to escape the modern industrialized food system and return to a more traditional natural practice. Importantly, foraging for food is also connected to some bigger, meaningful trends that we're seeing in consumer culture, like health and wellness. There's a belief that foraged foods are fresher and potentially more nutritious than commercially produced alternatives. Consumers interested in health and wellness, many of whom are also attracted to the idea of consuming foods that are free from pesticides and other chemicals. Furthermore, consumers are drawn to foraging because it feels authentic. It's tied to cultural or familial traditions. It can evoke a sense of nostalgia and heritage, as it often involves practices and knowledge that's passed down through generations. Again, it's also connected to some other trends that are meaningful to consumers, and that's with regard to sustainability and ethical consumption. Foraging is perceived as a sustainable practice. Consumers feel it's a way to reduce their environmental impact, as well as a way to source food locally and minimize their carbon footprint. I also want to note that this particular signal is connected to another signal we talked about earlier this year, which is slow living, slowing down and reconnecting with nature. However, it is not mainstream, and it is not predicted to move into the mainstream in the near future, though we are predicting a whopping 83.9% growth in consensus and shared meaning. So what's the implications of that? Well, the topic is not new, but it's also not mainstream, as I mentioned. There's a growing cultural interest in this topic as well as participation, but it's not widespread among consumers. There's not that widespread acceptance or consensus. Different interpretations of the topic are competing, but we do see those dominant meanings I mentioned starting to emerge. There's room to shape this narrative, and the trajectory of the trend is becoming clearer, even if it's not fully stabilized. Now, an important piece here is that there is a barrier to mainstream adoption, and that is, in some places, it's not actually legal, and there is an overwhelming concern about safety and identifying natural items that we can safely eat. Now, having said that, there is an opportunity here to offer products designed for foragers, like shoes, like hiking shoes, or even premium foraged ingredients designed for foodies and health and wellness enthusiasts. However, these types of innovations will appeal to highly engaged consumers, and this type of innovation right now is most suited for really innovative companies and startups. What should these types of companies do? Well, think about how you can shape consumer perceptions. Introduce your own narrative about what foraging means. It could be self-sufficiency, ancestral wisdom, sustainability, wild beauty. Educate consumers through packaging, campaigns, content that ties foraging to desirable values like sustainability or even resilience. In this instance, we need to lead with technical sophistication. Early adopters in a culture tend to value products and experiences that show expertise and authenticity. As a result, we could consider using rare, wild-sourced, or seasonal ingredients while explaining the importance of their origins, highlighting ethical sourcing or regenerative practices to deepen that perceived value. Similarly, our early adopters are typically ideologically aligned with the values behind the trend. They're committed to those values. They often act as influencers who help define what the trend will mean for the mainstream audience later. These consumers are critical for building cultural momentum, even if the mass market isn't quite ready yet. Now, even for our innovative and willing to take a risk startups and companies, we still want to consider how we can mitigate that risk. And we can do that by starting with limited launches to learn and iterate, use this period to build trust before mass competition emerges. Now, having said that, what does it mean for a larger company that is focused on scale to achieve ROI, right? So for them, appealing to foragers or the group of consumers that are really interested in foraged ingredients is likely too niche and too early. So one option for our larger companies is to monitor this to determine if the opportunity will grow and if the timing will become right as it becomes more mainstream. Another option is to use this signal to appeal to mainstream consumers by focusing on the values associated with food foraging that actually have broader appeal today. So how can we do that? How can we bring foraging to the mainstream? What are some strategies for scalable, culturally resonant innovation? Right, and as these ingredients and practices move beyond niche appeal to a broader cultural awareness, there's a key opportunity to make this emerging trend feel accessible, relevant, and trustworthy for a mainstream audience, right? We need to do this while managing cost and scalability. So consider the following strategies. Again, seasonal and limited editions, making those special but not elitist. We could introduce foraging products as limited time or seasonal offerings to create excitement while managing sourcing and pricing constraints. For example, a fall line of skincare with wild rosehip, or a spring line of granola with seasonal wild herbs. Again, we need to focus on seasonal discovery, not exclusivity, in order to invite curiosity from mainstream consumers. Similarly, storytelling is going to play a key role here, but in this instance, we want to simplify provenance, highlight where the ingredient comes from and how it connects to nature and tradition, but make sure you're using accessible language to build that emotional resonance and justify value. We also want to emphasize heritage and wellness over trendiness in appealing to a mainstream audience. Tie these ingredients to things like ancestral practices, local traditions, or cultural heritage, while emphasizing holistic wellness, a priority that we've noted is already growing in mainstream consumer culture. So by offering a taste of the wild in a familiar, values-aligned way, brands and companies can introduce mainstream audiences to the benefits of foraged ingredients without the barriers of exclusivity, price, confusion, as well as those safety concerns. The key is to balance uniqueness with relatability and innovation with accessibility. Let me give you another example. And this example is further along on our maturity curve and has slightly different implications. This example is biohacking. So again, at its core, it's about finding hacks to optimize our wellness and our vitality. But if we look at those dominant meanings and the motivations that are at play in this culture, we see that biohacking centers on a desire to take control of one's health, with consumers looking for simple, foundational practices to enhance their daily well-being and feel empowered in managing things like energy, aging, and their overall health. Consumers are motivated to boost mental sharpness and physical performance using things like supplements and routines aimed at improving brain function, appearance, vitality, whether it's for work, play, sport, what have you. Furthermore, in this culture, data-driven health management is important. Tracking health data like sleep, inflammation, metabolic risk enables informed, measurable improvements. And this tech-enabled approach reflects a desire for precision and self-awareness in health management. Lastly, there's a strong DIY mindset that drives consumers to test and tailor their routines. Whether it's supplements or sleep hacks, they're creating personalized approaches to wellness and a sense of identity through ongoing experimentation. So again, let's look at our sizing. What you're going to notice here is biohacking, there's more consensus. We're further along that early consensus stage of maturity, and in fact, with a large growth rate, we are predicting that this will move into the mainstream in the next year or two. So this has slightly different implications for what we do with this signal. In fact, we want to act now if we're going to influence the narrative. Since biohacking is not fully defined, companies, and this is mainstream companies or large-scale companies focused on scalability, can shape what biohacking means for their category. Whether it's self-optimization through nutrition, skincare, routines, or data. You can introduce your brand as a credible translator of biohacking for everyday life. Right? This is the moment to set these expectations before they harden and into the mainstream. We also need to focus on building solutions for a growing and more mainstream audience, right? This population is already meaningful and expanding. So think about launching products, services, or experiences that reflect emerging values of control, measurement, enhancement, or longevity. But create smart entry points, guided systems, simple tracking tools, ingredient-led enhancements that are designed for curious newcomers and not just for those hardcore enthusiasts and early adopters. We also need to demonstrate technical depth and transparency, but our success depends on clear technical storytelling. We need to offer legitimacy without gatekeeping. We can't alienate the everyday consumer with jargon, but instead, we do need to signal intelligence to earn trust. Again, we need to think of our positioning for a mainstream audience. These consumers will want clarity and convenience. They will reject anything that is overly complex. Yet there's still some flexibility when it comes to format, delivery, and lifestyle integration. But nonetheless, given the sizing and cultural maturity of this particular trend, the timing is now if we want to have that impact on the mainstream audience. And so a few ways that we can lead the cultural shift, right? As it's poised to move into the mainstream, our forward-thinking companies have this really rare and interesting window to shape the category and build that early trust, as I mentioned. As our consumers are looking for control, performance, personalization, they want it to be accessible, they want credible solutions to achieve their goals. So here's a few key strategies for CPG companies. How can we make biohacking simple, functional, and ultimately everyday? Well, functional innovation with purpose. Develop foods and beverages that deliver clear performance benefits using ingredients that are familiar enough for daily use, but sophisticated enough to signify science. Some examples are snacks with fortified ingredients, things like nootropics, drinks designed to enhance focus or recovery. Focus on benefits like energy without the crash or mental clarity, not just the ingredients. Personalized nutrition is another opportunity here, right? And we can make it scalable by introducing modular or customizable solutions, thinking of mix-ins, build your own kits, or tailored subscriptions that adapt to personal health goals. But the key here in appealing to that mainstream audience is keep the process easy and intuitive. Avoid technical overwhelm and jargon. It's about everyday education, creating bite-sized content. Think of videos, guides, app integrations that actually help consumers understand how to start small. Biohacking routines don't need to be extreme, and if they are overly extreme, they are likely to be rejected by our mainstream consumer. So emphasize habit building and not the hacking. For consumer health companies, we can translate biohacking into trust and tangibility. Here, there's opportunity for things like goal-specific supplement line formulated for things like cognitive clarity, energy optimization, sleep quality, cellular health. Again, we need some science-backed messaging that avoids jargon. Transparency is key. Share the why and the how of each ingredient. Consumers here would also be interested in tools that put control in their own hands. Things like accessible tracking tools, apps, dashboards, kits that help consumers visualize their progress in real time. Focus on popular, understandable metrics, things like sleep, energy, stress, metabolism. Finally, curate community. Avoid complexity. You could launch online communities that support peer learning and experimentation. Again, this taps into a broader trend. We see consumers looking to one another for trust and transparency. They're looking to people like them to learn and discover, right? So offer spaces for consumers to share tips, routines, progress, creating brand advocates and cultural momentum. As I mentioned, biohacking is moving into the mainstream. It's moving away from being a niche idea, and the expectations that consumers have will be centered around empowerment, optimization, and proactive health. Brands that enter now can set the tone, own the language, and earn the long-term loyalty by making this trend understandable, attainable, and results-driven for the everyday consumer. So with that, let's give some key takeaways.
Yeah, thanks, Gerald. I think those examples are really great. But the key takeaways from our look at signals and innovation is first, that not all that is new is meaningful. True innovation depends on distinguishing the noise and the fads from the genuine cultural signals that have meaning and are going to be deeply rooted in consumer beliefs and values. Our second takeaway is that signals reveal where culture is going, not just where it's been. By decoding emerging meanings in consumer conversations, our approach at Lux see early stage shifts before they become mainstream and allows us to predict their growth. And finally, the third takeaway is that predictive anthropology turns culture into foresight. We allow innovators to know the connections and the deeper meaning behind signals at an early stage of maturity, and lets them get in at the early stages to innovate, to connect with consumers, and to develop products that are going to be relevant and resonant.
Thanks, Cheryl and Matt. Thank you. We will now be taking questions that you may have on the presentation, which you can type into the questions box. If we don't get your question on this call, somebody from Lux will be in touch after the webinar. And as a reminder, feel free to email at questions@luxresearchinc.com. Now, let's see if there's any questions. Oh, okay, that's an interesting one. How to know if a signal is stable enough to act on now? What's too early? How do we know that it's too early or not?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it kind of depends a little bit on what your goals are and where you're willing to take some risks. So as we talked about, if we're quite early on, we are not necessarily going to have mainstream appeal. So for big brands, we might want to wait. We might want to monitor until we're confident that that signal is going to be relevant to a mainstream consumer. However, if we're an innovative brand or an innovative part of a brand, or we're a startup, we can appeal to those niche consumers. If we're not so reliant on scalability, we may go after that trend early. So it depends a little bit on who you typically target and why. But in some instances, it is a bit early. And I think the foraging example is a good one. If we wanted to go after that and we wanted to push it to the mainstream, we would need to take some key steps by connecting it to trends, topics, and values that are already meaningful to mainstream consumers.
Yeah, I think with the foraging example, it really shows how, because it has predicted growth, quite a lot of predicted growth. And while that growth isn't pushing it to the mainstream, it is showing that we see that it is stable enough because of its resonance with other topics, as you highlighted, health and wellness, sustainability, things like that, that are established and mainstream. And so this early signal is something that is connected in consumer minds and consumer conversations with it, even if the specifics of foraging are not what they're most interested in, or not the thing that they fully understand how it'll integrate into their lives just yet. But yeah, because we're focusing on meaning, we could actually see where there's real potential for connectedness. And depending on the type of brand you are, or the innovations that you have available to you, that'll sort of dictate how you get into that culture.
It's really interesting. And here's a related question. How accurate are your predictions? How do we know that a signal will move into the mainstream in the time frame that you're predicting?
Yeah, it is a great question. And so we do a number of benchmarking studies to determine how accurate our predictions are. And all things taken into account, obviously we don't have a crystal ball. However, we do know that our predictions are over 80% accurate, except in cases where there's a majorly disruptive event like a global pandemic. So we're quite confident that our growth rates are accurate and are guiding principles that our clients use to help determine if the timing is right for a launch, for a renovation, for some form of innovation.
Yeah, and I think that's why we often recommend like signal tracking as well. Like, clients will come and check a certain signal over time. In our syndicated reports, we often return to similar themes to see where they've gone, where they've grown. If there has been disruption, that's also very relevant. So yeah, I think again that's our historical approach that I talked about. It we have data from the past and not just present stuff, and that allows us to really have a more holistic or maybe global view of a topic and think about it not just in the now, but in the past and therefore in the future, for I think to guarantee a little more accuracy and a little more insight into a given signal or topic.
Yeah, along those lines, by looking at historical data, we ensure that we're not just focused on a fad or something that's only relevant 1 month or the next month. So absolutely, great point.
Well, we are at about time. If there's any other questions, please do reach out to us. But that concludes our webinar for today. The slide presentation and the recording from this webinar will be sent to all attendees via email today. And after leaving the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a survey. And we would appreciate any feedback you may have to help inform and improve future webinars. Take a moment and check out our upcoming webinars on our website. Thank you for joining us and have a great day.
So long.